ahead and let's dive into today's outcomes. There are 3 outcomes. The first outcome is to investigate the power behind the integration of an academic instructional framework and classroom behavior expectations that includes social emotional learning to support systemic implementation. This outcome is what I will be emphasizing throughout the beginning. And then the second outcome is to review classroom behavior expectations for specific learning procedures and routines within the context of the classroom and academic settings, and Jen will be covering that outcome towards the end. And then the last outcome is for you to be able to identify resources and strategies to support you within your local context. Another thing that we want you to know is that this outcome is closely aligned to, these outcomes are closely aligned to the tier fidelity inventory, features 1.4, 1.8, and 1.11, and the school-wide implementation, certain line items 3, 5, and 6. We want to reiterate that the information we're providing for you in this session is to support your work by providing kind of like a roadmap for systemic implementation of an integrated social, emotional, and behavior skills within academic instruction. We're not intended to add one thing on your plate, but it's supposed to add values and purpose to what you and your team is already doing within your system. So with that being said, I'm thinking about our outcomes and thinking about our journey in this work. I want us to take a look at this, the 2 graphics on the slide. And traditionally, I wanted to point out that our school has been the central focus where students and our programs and our community and our local resources evolve around the school. And this kind of operation and infrastructure has worked for the industrial age, but as we know right now, currently, and where we are, we're in the information age, and we need to really shift our beliefs and our practices to ensure that our school is organized to support the needs of the learners and not the school itself. So if equity is the heart of everything that we do, we want to ensure that all learners have the opportunity and access to 1, experience culturally responsive instruction and high expectations for behavior and academic content, and 2, develop self-advocacy and apply social, emotional, behavior, and academic skills, and 3, cultivate these lifelong habits through racial and cultural identities. This is why developing the Wisconsin framework for an equitable multi-level system support by continuously implementing a school-wide PBIS helps to put the learners at the center of the focus. With that said, let's take a look at the amazing, diverse, and complexity of our learners so that we can efficiently and effectively develop equitable opportunities and access for them. So I'm sure many of you have seen this graphic, and this graphic just simply represents, illustrates the strengths and areas of needs of a learner. As you can see on the slide at tier 1, the learner is proficient in science, hallway behavior, and in attendance. And she may need additional support in Phi-Ed and language arts, as well as intensive support in reading and in math. In this case, it would be he or she may need replacement or accelerated curriculum in math. So this case scenario is emphasizing that we can't label this learner a tier 3 student, right? Such practice is not about creating labels for kids or rooms that we send our kids to, but instead it's about using a holistic approach to understand the learner's academic and behavioral and social and emotional strengths and needs, and responding in a systemic manner that is consistent and reliable. We do caution schools to revisit and revise their language and practices so that we are ensuring we're labeling our services and not our students and staff. The first step, when we think about instructional framework, we need to really consider what instructional framework are we going to select? And this instructional framework must be best fit for your student and for your staff and for your school. However, we recommend that any instructional framework that you decide to implement must grow out of the Wisconsin's guiding principles for teaching and learning. And when you're selecting instructional framework, your school leadership team needs to ensure the two following criteria are in place. One, a common research-based instructional framework must guide your curriculum, your teaching, your assessment, and the learning climate. And the second criteria is that this instructional framework should help your districts or schools to focus more clearly and cohesively on instruction by combining specific behavior expectations for student learning with specific instructional strategies that guide teaching and assessment. So agreeing upon an instructional framework is about ensuring that systemic practices are implemented with fidelity, and it's implemented across your entire school with all teachers in all grade levels and in all content areas. So as we continue to provide continuous support from Tier 1 to Tier 2 to Tier 3, that instructional framework, whichever one you choose to implement within your school, must be woven and integrated into Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 as you increase the intensity of support for your students. And when I say increase the intensity of support, I mean duration, size, group size, expertise, resources, etc. Through the use of instructional framework, what the really unique thing is that you can increase the intensity of support of the learners within the classroom, within Tier 1, right? Without having the learners leave the classroom to receive academic or behavior or both intervention elsewhere. It is all within your classroom, and you can bring the resources into your classroom at Tier 1 through this instructional framework and using multiple resources and expertise in your building. So now that we know that we can meet the learners' needs and increasing intensity of support at the classroom level, let's take a closer look at what are the components of instructional framework. So this, we know that students need explicit teaching and modeling that provide them with access to deep comprehension so that they can demonstrate such knowledge and skills with confident and fluency. Fisher and Fryer have developed the Gradual Release of Responsibility. This is an instructional framework for learners to access complex texts. We want to emphasize that the Gradual Release of Responsibility framework is relevant and applicable to teaching behavior expectations as well. The ultimate goal of the Gradual Release of framework is to develop competent, independent learners. So as you can see here, the blue triangle on the left-hand side of the screen is the teacher's responsibility. The purple triangle on the right is the student responsibility. And the gradual release of responsibility begins with the focus lesson. That's the first phase. And where it's the I do it, right? This is where the teacher, you can see the teacher modeling the expected behavior or the language needed to be used in the content. The teacher is directing and scaffolding the explanation, and the teacher is demonstrating what good behaviors look like, sound like to achieve academic success. The second phase is the guided instruction, and that's still the teacher's responsibility. That phase is known as we do it, right? So in that phase, we see the teacher reteaching, coaching, and reviewing with the students. She's modeling, she's demonstrating, and the students are also doing it with her. And then we move on to the third phase, which is now fall into the student responsibility. And that phase is known as you do it together. So this is where students have the opportunities to practice the academic or the behavior skill set that we want students to be able to demonstrate, and they're interacting with their peers. And then finally, the fourth phase is the independent phase, and that is known as you do it alone. And in this phase, by this time, right, when we implement a gradual release of responsibility, by this time, we should be able to hear the pin dropped in our classroom. This is where we know the students that the students have the stamina and the perseverance to master the academic and the behavior skill set independently without us intervening and redirecting and recoaching. So in a quick sense, I kind of went over through the gradual release of responsibility. If you would like to dive into the gradual release of responsibility framework, please check out Fisher and Fry's book, A Structure for Instruction That Works. They have such a great depth of resource, and it's so great that you can spend some time in diving into that. So we share with you the gradual release of responsibility. By all means, you don't need to use that. Any instructional framework is evidence-based practices. It's equitable practices. And as educators, we believe that all students will learn. Otherwise, we won't be in this business, right? However, we can't expect our students to learn at high levels if we're not using a systemic instructional framework across our school. There is a misalignment between our beliefs and our practices when we do that. So this question really address, these questions really address, like, how does your framework compare to the gradual release of responsibility? And what does this framework really, does this framework, and in what ways does this framework benefit all students? So thinking about where you are, your school's journey, I want you to quickly chat in the box if you are able to articulate your instructional framework that you currently have in place, and your rules and routines and your procedures within the classroom. And if you can't, then think about these questions and think about what you need, what your next step is, all right? So if you can articulate your instructional framework, please chat in the box. Awesome. Wonderful. I see that some people said we use a gradual release of responsibility model. Thank you. So the skill developed model emphasizes the importance of new skill strategy needs to be explicitly taught and modeled. So students will learn with 80 to 90% accuracy. Right? The skill developed model, which is adapted from Heron and Eaton instructional hierarchy, illustrate the two first steps, the newly taught skill or strategy and learning with accuracy must be explicitly taught for students to achieve and master with accuracy around 80 to 90. And I wanted to say, challenge it 100%, right? And we want to make sure that we have those two steps grounded in that skill development model, whether it's academic skills or behavior skills, before we continue to move on to the continuum. So we want to make sure that we teach the skills so they become, they learn it with accuracy, right? The first time, learn it correctly. They practice it until it becomes automatically, or they internalize it, and they continue practicing so generalizations happens. Just like, for example, if we teach our students an academic skill, we can't send a student home to practice a reading fluency passage without, ensuring that the learner has learned what speed sounds like, what prosody sounds like, what is accuracy sounds like in that passage. And so the same goes for behavior. We teach and we need to reteach until we know that 80 to 90 to even 100% of our students have it with accuracy. With that being said, the statement, Jen, you can move on to the next slide. With the statement from Hermer is a great reminder that we cannot assume students know the expectations or rules or appropriate ways to behave, especially when we are consciously aware of the difference between the school culture and our students' cultures. And we cannot assume that our students will learn expected behaviors without direct instruction. We must assume that our students require differentiation and reteaching to learn the expected behavior. And so now that we understand the gradual release of responsibility is an equitable practice that can be implemented and should be implemented systemically across our districts and schools, let's take a look at the types of skill sets that we need to consider. So as we approach the fall, the question here is, what are the social, emotional, and behavior skills that we need to systemically implement and teach for all students to successfully complete in academic tasks or activities in this new setting. We know as educators that our students come to us with specific academic and cultural behavior skill sets in place. This is their culture. This is their identity from the school, from the home that they're bringing into our school, right? And we need to take the time to honor and respect and strengthen what the assets that they bring to us. And we need to take the opportunity to enrich our school culture through our students' culture. So in our school, with that being said, in our school, we also have specific academic and cultural and behavior skill sets that our students need to know and be able to do so that they can achieve at high levels, right? And so the instructional framework and the explicit modeling that we do systemically within our classrooms and across our schools are best practices that are used to build a bridge between the home and the school culture, so that our students can navigate the school culture fluently and competently without losing who they are. So addressing these differences and the gap is about building a community of inquiry based on our system's beliefs and practices in supporting the needs of our learners. Again, from the PBIS lens, when we think about classroom environment, we need to consider the importance of integrating both the academic and the behavioral elements by honoring and leveraging on the strengths the students bring inside and outside of our school. And this is where the natural integration occurred and should occur. This is a journey, really closing the differences and bringing and bridging those cultural gaps is a journey for us. And so remember to go slow to go fast and ensure that we continue to provide explicit instruction so that all learners can be successful as we move forward in this changing time. So Nancy Fried and Douglas Fisher, the creators of the Gradual Release Responsibility Framework, and Dominic Smith reminds us that learning encompasses the learner's social, emotional, and cognition. And addressing the social and emotional needs of the learners and putting systemic practices in place is equity. And we need to make sure that all staff are implementing and supporting in order to support the needs of all learners within our content and grade level teams. We need to help students remain, so by using the instructional framework, we're helping students to remain calm and relaxed in a state of mind so that their emotions don't run too high and take over their brain and their body, and then we lose them, right? We lose them because we don't have the instructional framework and to support our teaching as well as the environment for students to thrive. So we all have experienced variations of anxiety and stress in our lives. Even coming to this conference, navigating our sessions, knowing where the chat box is, or even in our break rooms, wondering if we can see our participants' faces, our team members' faces, or even listening to me as I talk way too fast, right? And so those things are stressful. And knowing what the research says about anxiety and stress and how it affects how we can and cannot process information to make decisions can be debilitating. So the prompt of the slide asks us to think of a time when you or someone you know experienced anxiety or stress that debilitated decision-making, and how does this affect the next steps? So Jen is going to share an example, and then I'll share two quick examples before we proceed.
Okay. So something that I witnessed working with some colleagues, she was up presenting in front of a group of people, and she needed to find a certain tab that she had open, and she just couldn't find it. She was getting really frustrated. So the other presenter went up and was able to easily navigate to the tab that she needed. And what I could see is the more frustrated she was, the less that she could even process through what she was trying to look for. And we've all experienced that. And I just wanted to bring that to light, that even as adults, when we get frustrated or stressed, we just have a hard time processing, making decisions, following through on what we should. And just think of how much it's our students, and especially the little ones in school.
Thank you, Jan. So now I'm going to share you a couple examples. One is from the school lens, and then one is from being a mom from my personal local and immediate example. So through the academic lens, right, we have what I've seen as a EL teacher as well as a literacy coach is, and pretty much in the upper elementary to the middle school, where we have students read chapter books. And a teacher, and with all best intention, you will have teachers sit, and then students sit in a semi-circle reading books and doing round robin reading. And as I observe and watch, you can see just the stress and the anxiety on students who are what we call struggling readers or reluctant readers, or students with that speak a different language, what we call it EL students. And so that robin reading really caused those students to be in a very stressful way, and the students will try to do their best to read the passage when it's their time to read, right? But they feel so incompetent, and what I often hear is, I'm not a good reader, or I don't like to read. And so that practice of round robin reading, the practice that we put in place without the instructional framework to really model what fluency sounds like, or to read those words accurately, it really doesn't give the students the platform to be able to be successful and know what it sounds like to read fluently. And so that's an example through the lens of academics. So as for me, I asked my son, I said, honey, what are some things that are very stressful for you at school? And he told me, he says, Mom, I'm really stressed when my teachers give us homework to do. And I can't do that I can't do that problem. And I asked him a little bit about, what are some of the practices that they use? And he shared that with me. But what I realized is that without the absence of instructional systemic instructional framework in place, students don't have the mastery over that concept. So the homework should be able to demonstrate for that individual to master that skill independently. And if it's not, then what we have done in the classroom has not been effective, or the instructional practices that we have put in place is not effective. And so those practices continues to lead to disproportionality. So as you can see, there is a strong connection between the integration of behavior expectations and social emotional learning in academic skill sets here. It is so important to understand that we need to teach rules and routines and procedures and use instructional framework so that our students can independently demonstrate the knowledge and skills in our learning environment. And this is really about being safe and feeling belonging and being able to thrive and achieve both academic and behavioral success. Thank you, Jen, for sharing the video link and the book link as well. With that said, thinking about, where we are, our participants, and some of you are using gradual release of responsibility regularly, we know that we can't do this work, right? Implement it systemically across our schools in all content areas and all grade levels without investigating our time in looking at our collaboration structure at the universal level. So let's go ahead, let's dive into that to see what are the components you already have in place, and as well as what do we need to also consider and what the research says. So the research here shows that when teachers work together in a systemic and systematic manner, meaning we all share the same vision and beliefs, that all students will learn and will do whatever it takes, and we work together based on a methodical plan, we can achieve desirable outcomes. So when we are implementing an instructional framework at Tier 1, we need to ensure that the practices are implemented systemically across our district and across our school, in each content and in our grade level, in EL, in special education, in our music departments, in our FIAT departments, okay? And the reason why is that when the expectations and rules are common across the building and classroom, children, our students know exactly what to expect no matter where they are within their learning environment. Consistency across the different areas of the school minimize the social, emotional anxiety and stress that students experience on a daily basis, as you know. So in order to increase or create that consistency, collaboration has to happen. Let's take a closer look at some of the critical steps. We know that collaboration will look very different with social distance and as we transition between face-to-face and virtual. And we need to ensure that we need to continue to strengthen our collaboration structure, right? So here are some critical points that we want to articulate to you. And we know that you're really good. You're just all experts in this, but these are still very, very relevant, such as designating time and restructure our schedule, right? Whether it's face-to-face, whether it's virtual, whether it's flip-flop, whatever the instructional model may be for this coming fall, we still need to be committed to designating time for grade level teams to meet, for our building leadership team to meet, and we need to commit to that structured schedule. The other component that we want to articulate is to establish trust through group norms. Group norms are rules in which bound us as a group, as a team, as a school, in terms of how we show up to do the work, to have the conversation, right? And the group norms is really about, it encompasses the social presence, the cognitive presence, and the teaching presence, right? And also, as Amy had articulated in the beginning session, that trust, that self-care, we can't neglect that as well. That is part of the social presence. And so trust is built when we have rules and norms to live on and to ground us as a team. The other component is the trained facilitators. We want to make sure that we have people or individuals or team or grade level teams to lead the conversations. These are individuals that are trained to lead conversations, to lead the facilitation of the meeting. And so we need to make sure that we have individuals that can guide the conversations in team meetings. And then we also need to make sure that we have team meeting agendas, protocols with outcomes, and minute meetings. So the meeting agendas, what I wanted to say is you all have a strategic plan or from the district or improvement plan within your school building. Your improvement plan must have sub-actions, and your meeting agendas, grade level or content, must be aligned. That agenda and the topics must be aligned to that strategic or improvement plan that you have within your building. You also need to have protocols to drive the conversations so that you can achieve the outcomes. The school reform initiative, which I will put in the link in a little bit, has tons of protocols for you and your team to use, and has a variety of protocols to drive the conversations and the work that will meet the outcomes. You also need to have meeting minutes. Meeting minutes are to document what happened in the past, what's happening currently, and what's going to happen in the future, so that your team can come back, revisit, revise, and replan for moving forward. Not only are minute meetings crucial, but in terms of trust and transparency and accountability, you can share that across your grade level teams, across your school, in terms of this is what we're working on based on our plan, our school plan. And so there's that transparency and accountability that you hold each other accountable. So with that being said, I have a resource for you. It is the Framework Outline Template Collaboration. The hyperlink is up here, and Jen will chat it in the box for you so you can have access to that. But this Framework Outline Template Collaboration, we use it in our reading universal training. And what we have team do is that teams kind of investigate what best practices are around collaboration. And then once they're done investigating some of the research behind it, they discuss what collaboration looks like, their takeaway from the reading, and then they really look at this template. We give them the template, and they use markers. They use color-coded markers like right here. So I know this is pink, but we'll just pretend it's red, right? Red are things that are not in place. Okay, orange means we're still working on commitment, 80% commitment or buy-in. And the yellow marker represents things that we are in the planning phase. And then the green represents things that we're trying it out, we're implementing across our district, what people call it, we're in the midst of the storm, right? And then there's the blue marker, which means that we're at full implementation. This is what we do in our school, right? This is what collaboration looks like. And so what teams do is they use these markers and they go through the column on the left-hand side, collaboration among the staff within the universal level classroom, and they look at each of those components, those areas. And then on the right-hand side are the evidence or the actions, right? And then the three columns on the further right are grade levels. So what teams do is they look at the row across and they will highlight in terms of where they are within the implementation stages. What's really unique about this template is that teams will walk out of there and realizing, oh my goodness, these are the things that we don't have in place. Like they're not a priority right now or a focus right now. We know them, but they're not a priority. And these are the things that we are implementing full in our school, right? But they're kind of in a shaky stage, right? In the storm. So what we want to do is we want to move them into our full implementation, the way that we do business. So it's a great way for teams to gauge in terms of their journey around collaboration and what they need to work on. Can you please check in the box one thing that you plan to do with the framework outline template? When you have access to it, what's one thing that you plan to do so I can see your action? Oh, great. Kelly says they use that template. Awesome. Thank you. Yes. Emily says, get my team on board with highlighting our sheet. Yes. Highlighting is, and when the team do it together and they highlight together, that's really powerful. That is collaboration. Great. Some are planning to share with the administration team, and some says we have done it. Awesome. So wonderful. So this concludes my session, my part of outcome number 1 that says investigate the power behind the integration of an academic instructional framework and classroom behavior expectations that include both the social and emotional learning to support systemic implementation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jan.
As Moua shared, when we give a student an academic task, it's not just that they need to be able to have the academic skill set, but they also need that behavioral skill set and then that cultural skill set. And it's really our responsibility as educators to help bridge that gap for students and build those different skill sets that students are going to need. And we heard earlier from Amy Flamini that habits and routines, when we develop those, that really helps to decrease the amount of decisions that we need to make, and that relieves some of the stress that we feel. It's the same for kids. So if we can help the students learn some routines and habits that are going to make them successful, it's going to relieve some of their stress. So when schools ask, like, why do we need to have these expectations and routines? It's really to help everyone feel positive, safe, that things are consistent, and they know that everything is going to just follow a certain manner, and it's going to benefit everyone. So here on the left, you'll see the expectations, and these are really defined through PBIS. And over on the right are the rules, and the rules are really more specific. They're specific behaviors that happen in a specific setting. They're measurable, and they define and are aligned with that specific setting or task. And routines are really the steps that help you follow the rules. So they more or less are your habits that you develop. So just to develop some common understanding of some of the terms that I'm using, on the left again are those expectations and rules, and on the right are those indicators or examples. I'll probably land on indicators most of the time, and what they really are is they describe that specific skill, they apply to limited number of settings, they clarify the behaviors for the specific setting or routine, they're observable, they're measurable, understandable, they're always applicable. What I like to say is, like, what does it sound like, feel like, look like during that specific setting or that routine? So many of you have seen this, the structure of a matrix, and I just want to point out this is a school-wide matrix. We have our large expectations or our school-wide expectations on the left-hand side there: be responsible, be respectful, be safe. And then across the top are the settings, and this is the school-wide matrix. What I want to point out is that classroom column over to the right. And what we do is, as a school team, we recommend that you develop these together with your staff, get some families involved to provide some cultural aspects as well. But those classroom, you can develop some non-negotiable indicators that all of the classroom teachers are going to put within their classroom. And then that just brings me to this next slide here. So there's some transitions. This side, and you can see where the learning column is, the second column from the left. And that column would really pull in those non-negotiables. So the teachers have the autonomy to put across the top what are some of the routines in their classroom, but also they will have that learning or that classroom setting where they would have those non-negotiables. And I just want to go back and show you the school-wide matrix. And something I want to point out on here, which I think is really neat, is this school actually included on the bottom that little chart. And they took practices and strategies that the students are already familiar with, the staff are familiar with, and they posted them with their matrix so that visitors, parents, substitute teachers, when they come in, they have a reference, but they use some of that language up in that school-wide matrix. So that's what that slide is for. It's really just an example for you. So also on this matrix, I wanted to point out that the school has their agreed upon instructional framework. So they have the whole group learning, small group, and then the independent learning. Entering, so this classroom teacher entering the classroom might be an area where students have behavioral errors. So she put this on here so that she can work with the students and help build the skills on how it looks to enter her classroom. So, this here is an example of the classroom procedures and routines, and really what I want to highlight on here are some of these cultural practices that can apply. So maybe asking for help. What we want to think about is, would this cause some dissonance with some of our students? Like, how do we build the skill for students that are maybe in a culture where you're not supposed to ask for help. You're supposed to just observe and learn through that. So how do we build that skill? Because they may need that when they get into a job or higher learning. So we definitely want to work on that. Another area might be where a teacher has put eyes and ears on speakers. So in some cultures, to look an authority person face to face or to look at them is disrespectful. So how can we bridge that gap? How can we help, first of all, develop that skill, but also bridge it? So the parents might say, instead of saying eyes and ears on speaker, maybe show the speaker that you're listening. So what's another way that they could put that on their matrix so that is culturally relevant for all of the students in your classroom? Again, just pointing out that there's some, the agreed upon instructional framework is across the top of this matrix. So as you develop your classroom matrix, one of the things you have to do is determine what are the routines in my classroom. So here you can see on the left side that it talks about entering the classroom, attention signals, working independently. So these are different routines in a classroom that this teacher is going to specifically hone down and develop what are the indicators and the routines for each of these areas. And I have a link on this slide, as well as at the end of our session, there's a slide that has the links to it, the Culturally Responsive Classroom Management module. It guides you through all of this, how to develop your routines, how to incorporate that into your classroom matrix. So just be aware that there's a link at the end of our slides today. So this isn't anything new. This is something that I see in many classroom teachers have routines that they've posted, but one of the things to note is you can't just put this up and assume that the students know how to do this, right? We actually process through how, if you're absent, what do you do? Or how to show your swag. So whatever the teacher's posting, we actually go ahead and teach that. It's the same when you develop your matrix. You want to be sure that you process through it and teach the students. So here's a classroom matrix, and there's classroom reminders on here. And you can see across, again, they have their agreed upon instructional framework. And then they have some items here that they put in that class-wide. So those could be those non-negotiables that all of the staff have agreed upon. Actively listen. So you can see on actively listen that this might show up differently in your focused lesson, in your guided instruction, and collaborative learning. So you need to delineate how that shows up differently. And then maybe use appropriate voices and language. Again, that might show up differently in each of those different routines within the classroom. And something to think about is like, what is appropriate voice? What's appropriate language? So we need to think about, are those subjective terms, and how can we word that so that all students understand what an appropriate voice is? And I'll get into that in a few more slides. Another one is taking care of materials. So in some cultures, things are more community owned, so we can't expect that students will think that I need to take care of just my materials, but we build that community. So how do we help students understand that we take care of everything? That if we see someone drop a pencil on the floor or a book on the floor, that we pick it up, we don't just step over it. And then finally, as we develop our matrix, we make these relevant to who we're serving and to the students. So Kafudi, this was made by a middle school, and that's an endearing term that they use, and it actually stands for keep hands and feet and other objects to yourself. And the students have been taught what that looks like, what it looks like in the class, in their focused lesson, in the guided instruction. The big piece here is to remember that this can show up differently, but you teach it to the students, you guide them through this. Here's a great reminder, and I love how visual and dynamic and sustainable this matrix is. So here this teacher has put the expectations up. It's just 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper that are put on her bulletin board. How awesome is this, that as students develop some of these skills, you can pull that off, add new skills, it's handwritten. I mean, this is really an easy, simple way. Something I would point out is I love on this chart the review column. So if students have mastered a skill, if you don't want to pull something off, you could put it over there, because if you come back from Thanksgiving break or Christmas break and they kind of lagged on that skill, you could put it in the review column. Or you can do this and you can just have things that are really dynamic and you can just interchange them as needed. Here's an example of an elementary classroom. Again, if you notice on all of these, we're looking at that agreed upon instructional framework. The teachers all have that showing up, but it shows up a little differently, right? For middle school, high school, elementary, it's going to look a little different. On this matrix, when you show visuals, it's great, especially for those littles, like the 4K, 5K. But we don't just expect the students to know what those visuals are. We have to teach those, just like we teach everything else. And you can start adding some language and vocabulary on these so that the students, as they're growing and learning in school, that they can start picking up some of those words as well. And here's a middle school, and I just want to point out a few things. I mentioned I would talk about some of those subjective terms that we want to think about. So one of the areas is sit in your assigned areas. So if this is not always applicable, if there are times that the students might stand up in their area, we might want to just say stay in your assigned area or remain in your assigned area versus sit, because if sit is not always applicable, we wouldn't want to put it on here. And then also when we're thinking of subjective terms, soft voices, quiet voices, that can mean something different from me to you. So you definitely want to explain to them what is a soft voice or a quiet voice. Like, how do you explain that? A lot of schools use like 0, 1, 2, 0 for no sound, 1 for just maybe a whisper, 2 a conversation between 2 people, 3 is more of a group. So just having an understanding of what those are, because to me a soft voice and a quiet voice are pretty much the same thing. Appropriate language and voices. Again, what I find appropriate as language and vocabulary may be different from what you do. So we want to, maybe we could term that as use school language, what's appropriate in school, because we want everyone to feel safe and comfortable and competent in school. So what type of language is appropriate? I shouldn't use that term. What type of language would be acceptable in school? So we want to teach that to the students. And then this school actually looked at honoring personal space. So they had some cultures that were very specific about how close you would stand to them. So they took that to the step of putting it on their matrix, and they wanted to teach students that it's okay to know that sometimes someone needs a little bit more space when you talk to them, and that it's okay. There's differences in everyone. Here's a high school matrix, and I wanted to pull out of this. So this school has been trained in zones. They use the best screener data. They've been trained in CPI. They use a lot of that same vocabulary that they've already been taught right within this matrix. There's a few transitions here. I also wanted to point out that they're using some academic enabler skills. They're putting these right within the matrix so that this isn't something in addition that you teach to the students, but it's something that you're going to use, and it's a prompt for us as teachers, as educators, to build this right within our academic lesson plans, which we are going to get at in the session that immediately follows this. Another thing is they're starting to look at social and emotional skills. So regulating emotions, recognizing and appreciating differences. So these are items that we can put within our matrix. And something really important to do is, as you create your matrix, create these with your students. Even those little elementary kids, you can coach them into what are some of the things that we should all do when we're in a whole group? What should we do when we're in partner work? Especially when you get, you know, later elementary, 5th, 6th grade and up, those students really want to be able to participate in building the structure of their classroom. And it also gives them that encouragement and ownership to enforce and to follow what they've put on here because they've created it with you. So the actively listen to the teacher speaker off of that other one, I want to pull that out, and they will go into more depth in the next session. But we can't just put that on our matrix and think that that's all that it means is just actively listen to the teacher speaker. This teacher actually talked to the students. What does it look like to you to actively listen to the teacher or speaker? And this is what some of the students came up with, is remain neutral, avoid distractions. Listen to the words to understand the complete message. Be able to paraphrase what the speaker said. So there's so much more depth to it than just that one piece that says actively listen to the teacher speaker. It goes into this much depth that we teach to the students, and so that they know exactly when the teacher says actively listen, they know exactly what that's going to look like. And we explain to why. We want to make it relevant for them because we want them to understand the purpose of actively listening so that they can avoid misunderstanding, so they know what they're supposed to learn, so that they can obtain information. Again, I want to point out these culturally responsive classroom management modules. They are an awesome resource for you. Lean into these, go in and dig into those. I'm actually going to have a follow-up on Monday, September 28th, just from 3:30 to 4. I'll do a brief overview of how you could use these and what's in each of the different modules. And again, you can sign up for that on that link that I have on another slide. I hope someone's monitoring the chat because I just have not had a chance to do that.
I am, Jan, I am. And the link is also provided. And we do have a couple questions. So just
okay. Okay, great. I know she said I have about 3 more minutes. Something as we wrap up, I want you to think about, do you have an agreed upon instructional framework? Remember, on the top of all those matrices, from elementary through high school, we had that agreed upon instructional framework. It looks different maybe from elementary to high school, but they had that whole group instruction. They had group, small group, and they had individual work. But we also have that autonomy for teachers. Other routines within their classroom that their students maybe are struggling with, and they need to put that on their matrix. Do you have collaborative structures in place? Moua talked about that, the importance of that. If you come up with some non-negotiables to put on that matrix, you need to have those collaborative structures in order to develop those non-negotiables. Do you have school-wide and classroom matrices that are developed and that they support your academic lesson plans? And then also we wanted to lean into those assessments that we have. So the SIR, the TFI, we talked about the tiered fidelity inventory, the line items 1.4, 1.8, 1.11, and then the school-wide implementation items, which are items 3, 5, and 6. These are all items that we see schools as rating lower and that they're areas that schools need support. And it's one of the reasons this session and the next one are here is because we know those are areas that schools would like support on. And we want to encourage you to reach out to your Wisconsin RtI Center Technical Assistance Coordinators, which we have a link on the bottom of the slide to find who your Technical Assistance Coordinator is in your region. Here is the second part of the session, which really gets into how you integrate your some academic skills or skills right within your academic lessons. So during those daily lessons and thinking of your students going back to school, wearing masks, using sanitizer, like how during transitions, you're going to have to teach them when they come back, do they need to use sanitizer? What a great way to do that right within your academic lesson. It doesn't have to be like just a standalone, but teach that right during your academic instruction. So our outcomes for today were to investigate the power behind the integration of academic and behavioral expectations, also to review classroom behavior expectations for specific learning procedures and routines, and then I identified some resources for you. So your technical assistance coordinator, the culturally responsive classroom management modules, the 5 factors for sustainability.